Hi, my name is Anna Vilner, and today I'll be reading from a book of crónicas by the Argentine author Hebe Uhart. And this collection is called A Question of Belonging. It'll be out with Archipelago Books next month in May in my English translation. And the piece that I've selected to read today is a travelogue of sorts. It features a young Hebe en route to La Paz, and it brings together some of my favorite things about Hebe's writing. So, the power of her everyday observations and her fascination with other people, like their language and gestures. And I've abbreviated the piece, so I'll indicate where that happens. Un viaje a La Paz, a trip to La Paz. When I was 20 years old, I went abroad for the first time. The train to La Paz took 3 days, and it was easy to meet people on board. I went with Hukkila, who was a few years older than I was. To me, she was the essence of mystery and refined intelligence, qualities I lacked. She had an air of Jean Moreau about her and was always lounging on her bunk bed. When she did come down, it was as if she had no choice but to do so, as if the world were pressing her with its tedious demands. She said the most clever and fascinating things without glancing away from her little mirror, and plucked invisible hairs like a queen exiled from her country. Left without a servant to take care of such inferior chores, she was eternally humiliated to be fending for herself. I admired how naturally she expressed her ideas, revelations that I would have announced to the whole train, and how she reflected on her mysterious past. Once, we passed a cafe I wanted to go into. Not this one, she said. It's haunted. I took this statement literally. Does she actually believe in ghosts, I thought, and said something timidly to that effect. She clarified that she meant it symbolically, and I didn't ask anything more. It wasn't the right time. So I'll go towards the end of the piece now. I continued roaming the train, one end to the other, in my jeans and red and white striped shirt. I needed a break, so I sat down in front of a young woman and her baby in second class. The woman was wearing a worn-out smoky blue suit and carried a purse of the same color. She was in heels. Her outfit seemed inappropriate for the journey, and I felt like the superior tourist. We smiled at each other. Her smile was cautious, as if she'd be ashamed to widen it too much. Her purse, her suit, and the child she was holding were all immaculate. The child's skin was gleaming, just like his little shoes. Something in that incongruity between the sad, worn-out shade of blue and her cleanliness interested me, and we began to talk. She was a teacher like I was and taught classes in a public school on the outskirts of La Paz. She told me that the school couldn't afford chairs for the students and that they sat on tree trunks. Chickens would circle nearby and distract the kids. They didn't have a map, chalkboard, or anything. Meanwhile, private schools, she said, have every luxury there is. I quit judging her inappropriate outfit. When she spoke, she was overcome by a kind of indignation that made me see her dignity. The conversation became more fluid after that. She took a chicken breast from her bag and cut it up into small pieces for the child. "Eat, honey," she said. Again, I thought it was inappropriate to bring chicken on such a long trip. We were at the border and she was going to La Paz, but she sliced it so carefully that I changed my mind. It was fine to eat chicken on the train after all. I began to think about our similarities and differences. Both of us were teachers. I was just starting out. But while she lived off her poor salary, I spent mine on travel and buying whatever bullshit caught my eye. I didn't plan on being a teacher for the rest of my life, and what's more, I taught at a school that had everything paid for by the government. I didn't want to improve anything at my school. I'd rather have burned it to the ground because the principal had it in for me. The way she hounded me was unbearable. She'd scolded me twice already for putting my briefcase on that desk. This woman, on the other hand, requested that the authorities send her maps, books, benches, and milk for her students. We had barely crossed the border when she took out a little Bolivian flag and gave it to the child. "Say Viva Bolivia, son." She, the child, and I said Viva Bolivia, and her smile widened sadly. It was like a gift for me. Okay, I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Hola a todos y muchos saludos desde la Ciudad de Mexico. Hello everyone and greetings from Mexico City. I'm Robin Myers and I'm the translator of The Brush, La Mata in Spanish by the Colombian poet Eliana Hernández-Pachón, which was published this month by Archipelago Books. In the words of the publisher, with a few adaptations of my own, The Brush is a tangled grove, a thicket of vines, an orchid pummeled with rain. Told in a sequence of both human and non-human voices, Hernández-Pachón's multi-part poem is an astounding response to a traumatic event in recent Colombian history, the massacre in the village of El Salado between February 16th and 21st, 2000. Paramilitary forces tortured and killed 60 people, interspersing their devastating violence with music in the town square. I'm going to read a brief selection from the third section of the book, which is also called The Brush, and I'll read the first bit of the first poem in Spanish first, before continuing in English. Las ramas que se cruzan en el fondo del monte no pueden contarse, tienen un principio vital, como los dedos gordos heredados de la familia y las cosas que caen sin remedio del cielo, torrente del agua lluvia. El agua lluvia golpea insistente las costras. El agua lluvia atenta contra la solidez de las piernas, humedece con su lengua el agua lluvia las cosas, las rosetas, las ciénagas, las aguas verdes del litoral. The limbs crisscrossing deep inside the woods are numberless. They have a vital purpose, like stout fingers passed down by blood, and everything that falls inexorably from the sky. Torrential rain. Rainwater batters scabs, rainwater pummels the sturdy legs, rainwater wets things with its tongue, the tiny buds, the swamps, the green course of the littoral. And so the thistles part like frailejones, the gentians, acacias, and periwinkles, the wild geraniums, the folding orchids, and the plegaderas that only grow far from the sea. And in that tangled grove that struggles to digest the land are thickets and ravines now hidden to the eye. The forest's hair snags angrily. They snap and snap, the hanging beards of lichen. The investigators explain. 70 more of those bullets are fired that day. A mere 10 strike the trees. As the bullets are fired, cheerful music plays. Cheerful music plays because, having fired the bullets, they want to play the drums. Before gathering everyone in the town square to ask the necessary questions, they bring out the audio equipment and drums from the houses and play this cheerful music loud and clear. In everyone's ears, the clamor of the bullets muddles with the drum roll. The witnesses say, "Yes, we heard something, but we said nothing. We couldn't say anything. The rainwater swarmed on the window sills. We heard something, but it was a snail trail slicking along, the summer heat irritation licking our faces. We thought it was the click-clack of the train. We said nothing, and anyway, what could we have said that they would have heard? Didn't everyone know by then? We're real men. If we open our mouths, will we be able to forget? We left. Northward from the forest, as we know, blows the wind, generous." The witnesses say, that day, when they reached the village, they asked if gorillas lived there, if they had women there, if they danced. Also, if the women cooked for them there, if the sun beat down hard there, if they took the occasional stroll. As they asked, they wanted to know if they'd gone to the end of the world, if they'd made love there, if they had roosters, and if their roosters sang or crowed. If they sang with the sun, like normal roosters, or if they were confused and sang at 11, at 7, at 10 o'clock. If there were days when they didn't sing at all. The brush adds, "For those who came back, a handful of totumo blossoms, pinuelas with their tender pulp, their starry white tomentum. These fleshy-petaled flowers, vanilla fragrant in the night, and other flowers, furious, experts in disobedience, the many-flowered heliconia, the hidden thorns that snagged the skin, an invasion of bougainvillea, a parade crowned by tireless sepals. Some, the ones with calyxes, accompany the fruit, others are sterile. Clusters, too, of yellow cestrum flowers, of candelabra flowers, and of the flower they call amor que zumba, love abuzz, abundant clusters, blooming from themselves."
Hello, my name is Lara Norgaard. I am a translator from the Indonesian and the Portuguese. And today I'd like to talk to all of you about some generative puzzles that came about in my translation of the novel People from Oetimu by Felix Nesi, which is forthcoming from Archipelago Books. So, People from Oetimu is a novel written in Indonesian and set in West Timor, which is in the eastern part of Indonesia. And today, the eastern half of the island of Timor is an independent country, it's East Timor, but that only came about in the early 2000s. So, West Timor is the other half. The novel opens in July 1998 and then cycles backwards in time to independence movements against Portuguese rule in the 1970s, the period of Japanese occupation in the 1940s, and then back again to 1998 and to a series of strange and disturbing events that occur on the evening of the World Cup final. In terms of the texture of its prose, People from Oetimu is written in literary Indonesian, but it also reflects the multilingual context of Timor. So Felix Nesi incorporates expressions from Wabmeto, Tetum, those are some local languages on the island of Timor, as well as from Portuguese and dialects that are only spoken in Timor into this Indonesian novel. And that's one of the things that makes the novel really, really unique. And it made it unique in the Indonesian literary scene. And I am sure it will be unique in English, but it's also one of the features of the book that is tricky to translate. So today I'd like to read two passages in which multilingual context of Timor arises, and specifically when humor hinges on a context in which characters speak multiple languages. And then I'll talk about how I chose to approach the translation of those sections of the book. Without further ado, I'll start reading the first passage. And just a note here, this passage is more one that hinges on an awareness of a sort of historical awareness of the multilingual context of Indonesia, rather than actual multilingual elements in the prose. And then the second one will deal with with actually having the other language there, or another language there. Here I go. No one was unfamiliar with the name Amsiki, not even in the most remote corners of the archipelago. He was the only person on Earth to kill more than 10 Japanese soldiers, burn a forced labor camp to the ground, and live on to tell the tale. It was unheard of to escape the samurai sword under Japanese occupation. If a soldier wanted you killed, that was that. If he chose to let you live, you'd probably end up dead regardless, since you'd be whipped and forced to work without food or raped day and night. Famed for his impressive feats, Amsiki was respected across the country. His distinguished name spread from one town to another until he became known on distant islands as a hero, a knight who slayed the Japanese to defend his bangsa, his nation, from the colonizers' ironclad fist. But Amsiki shrugged off the praise. I never killed anyone to save bangsa. That's what he'd say, mistaking the unfamiliar Indonesian word for the name of another laborer who vanished when he set fire to the camp. He and I weren't that close, actually. Nothing I did was in the service of anyone. All I wanted to do was save my horse. People would laugh, but Amsiki was being serious. This is his story. So then the novel launches into Amsiki's life history, and we find out that he is a very, very old man. No one knows his actual age, and he lived through Dutch and Portuguese colonization as well as Japanese occupation. The context here that's largely left implied in the Indonesian is that it's not very likely that Amsiki at this point in the novel would know how to speak Indonesian very fluently. Indonesian comes from Malay, and it only became a national language that was taught in schools after the country's independence in the 1940s. Now, Malay was used as an administrative language under Dutch colonialism, but only around 2 or 3% of Indonesian people spoke it as their first language prior to independence. And since then, that's changed radically, and it's a hugely important language now. But in Timor, in this particular moment, and especially for someone who's as old as Amsiki, probably spoke other languages, and in this case, he probably was most comfortable and fluent in Uabmeto. So let's go back to this passage with that context in mind and talk about why it's tricky, what's going on here. The first thing that's going on is specifically just like that context that I outlined. To an Indonesian audience, it would be pretty easy to guess that Siki doesn't speak Indonesian, given his age. Secondly, the word bangsa, which means nation, is at least a plausible proper noun for someone. So when Siki hears everyone talking about how he heroically saved Bangsa, he thinks that people are referring to a person at the camp, not the concept of the nation. And he can in a very straight-faced way, completely brush off this heroic, patriotic sentiment that people are placing on him. And as a result, we have this delightful satirical moment that shows the disjuncture between the concerns of someone living in Timor at this period with the priorities, directives, and sort of ruling ideologies of the nation state. That's one of the reasons why I think this particular moment in the text is absolutely brilliant. But all of this is pretty difficult to get across in English translation. You know, the word nation is hard to imagine as a proper noun, so it would be difficult for us to picture that. And it's pretty unlikely that someone in English would confuse the concept of nation with the name for a person, even if nation were a proper noun. And all of that, it's just so baked into the language, which has such a long-standing history. And all of this is very different than the word bangsa, specifically in Timor at that particular moment in time and for a character like Siki. So there were a few options for how I could have dealt with this and how I could have gone about this translation. The first is I could have translated bangsa into nation and simply capitalized it when that moment of dialogue happens, hoping that readers will fill in the gaps that are left unsaid, in the contextual gaps that come up. This would read mostly like the following. I never killed anyone to save nation. That's what he'd say, mistaking the word for the name of another laborer who vanished when he set fire to the camp. So it's kind of clear, right? He mistakes the word nation for this name, but it's not necessarily that funny, and it might be a little confusing as to why it happened. Option 2. There's a very short glossary that actually accompanies this novel, and that's going to be in Archipelago's edition at the back. But also there was a glossary in the Indonesian source text at the front of the novel, specifically because of how many times words in other languages arise over the course of the text. Many Indonesian readers who aren't from Timor or Eastern Indonesia would need some kind of gloss in order to understand what's going on. So I could have taken advantage of the presence of that glossary, and I could have translated, I could have chosen to not translate the word bangsa at all. And then I could have added it as an Indonesian word into that glossary and expected readers to go look it up. The problem there is that people would have to look it up because the passage wouldn't really make sense if you just had the word bangsa. And then they would have to kind of remove themselves from the text, go look it up. And in my opinion, that messes with the rhythm of the passage, with the narrative voice of the passage, which is this wonderful sort of storytelling tone that arises at this particular moment in the narrative, and I think it would ruin the flow of what's going on here. So my solution was kind of a middle ground between the two, which was to gloss what was going on. And by gloss, I mean add little turns of phrase or extra words into the prose in order to give our reader a little bit more context, to guide the reader towards a way of understanding this. So I'll read again just the part where the word bangsa comes up and show you what I did. His distinguished name spread from one town to another until he became known on distant islands as a hero, a knight who slayed the Japanese to defend his bangsa, his nation, from the colonizer's ironclad fist. But Siki shrugged off the praise. I never killed anyone to save bangsa. that's what he'd say, mistaking the unfamiliar Indonesian word for the name of another laborer who vanished when he set fire to the camp. So what I did here, if you noticed, is I added the word bangsa as a gloss, or I added the word nation as a gloss to bangsa in the prose prior to the moment of dialogue when Amsiki has that confusion. So, a knight who slayed the Japanese to defend his bangsa, his nation, from the colonizer's ironclad fist. There isn't that repetition, that gloss in the source text. So I added that in so we would associate the word bangsa with nation. Then, when Amsiki shrugs off the praise, he can say, I never killed anyone to save bangsa, capital B. And the reader will immediately see the parallel between the two concepts. And additionally, I added that he's mistaking the unfamiliar Indonesian word for the name of another laborer, which hopefully gestures to some of the context of, okay, he's not that comfortable in this particular language. This is an unfamiliar concept, an unfamiliar word to this particular character. Hopefully, people understand and find this moment as clever as I do. And now I'm going to talk about a second example, which involves not the multilingual context, but actually a moment of another language entering Felix Nesi's Indonesian prose. And in this example, I did end up taking advantage of the glossary, and I'd like to talk about why. So while translating, when Uwab Meto came up in the text, I would usually refer to that glossary that was in the source edition, in the Indonesian version. But sometimes I'd also talk to the author, to Felix Nesi, to more fully understand how an expression worked. And especially in Uwab Meto, also in Tetum, Portuguese I fortunately have in my linguistic repertoire, so I could handle those portions. But at one point I came across the following passage, which is descriptive, so it doesn't really require that much introduction. I'll just read for you. Next to the reading room was the dining area at the back of the rectory. It held a long table lined with 12 chairs. On the wall to the left was a huge painting of Jesus eating penpasu alongside 15 old men wearing Timorese sarongs, an image reminiscent of the Last Supper, minus the table. None of the old men had any teeth, and as a result, anyone who saw the painting couldn't help but ask why the artist would depict a scene of people sharing a meal and choose to make everyone toothless. Father Joseph couldn't give them an answer since the painting was attributed to a French artist who faked his death and ran to Timor in an effort to escape the stifling European art world. He became known as Kais Muit Aseket, since for all the years he lived on the island, he had only come down to town to draw or ask questions about pigments used to dye yarn, until finally he was killed from people by the north, killed by people from the north who assumed that all white men are thieves. Excuse me. The expression at hand that's in question is this name that's given to the artist, Kais Muit Aseket, right? And when I was translating, I realized that actually this name, Kais Muit Aseket, was not in the Indonesian glossary, in that Indonesian version. So after translating the novel, I was speaking to Felix and I asked him what it means. And he told me it's from Uwab Meto and it means lost white guy. And I just thought that was brilliantly hilarious that he became known as Lost White Guy, and that's sort of the name, his reputation. It's just another layer to the joke that I thought was brilliant. But it was very interesting to me that most Indonesian readers wouldn't have actually gotten that in the first publication of this novel from Jakarta. And Felix had once told me that he had written this novel for his friends, for his communities, for his community on Timor, and that he had really wanted to write a novel that spoke to their lives, to their realities, to their modes of storytelling, and so on. So in the source text, this particular joke about the lost white guy was something that just landed for them. That didn't land for every single reader who was reading the book. And on the one hand, I wanted to create that sense of not knowing the meaning that so many readers have already experienced with this particular passage. So I kept the Uwab Meto and didn't translate the name directly to Lost White Guy in the prose. But since we have a glossary, I just couldn't resist adding Kais Muit Aseket, so that if the reader wants to, they can get in on the joke. Anyway, thank you so much. I think I'm out of time, but it was wonderful to speak to you all virtually today. Remember to keep an eye out for the novel People from Oetimu by Felix Nesi, translated by me, Lara Norgaard, and forthcoming from Archipelago Books.
The title is 1001. It's a novel I wrote. David Hackston translated it from Finnish to English, and Contra Mundum Press published it in December 2023. And the first question was concerning the title. Yes. When you, for the first time, take the book in your hands and you see the title without knowing very much what's going to happen there on the pages, the number 1001 probably refers to the Arabian Nights, the vast collection of stories that's translated into English with that title. And this number refers to the number of nights Scheherazade is telling stories to King Shahryar. And she is telling what she's telling, but every morning she stops in the middle of a story in a point full of suspense. And she does this in order to avoid being executed by King Shahryar, who has this habit with his brides. So now, instead of this, Shahryar postpones it because he wants to know how the story continues. So the number is referring to at least two things intertwined: telling stories and survival. Pardon. But in the same way, in the novel 1001, it's a question of survival. There are disasters, individual, common, man-made, natural, or it's a question of destructivity or self-destructivity of humans. Practically all the main characters struggle with survival. There's British-Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who probably during all his adult life was daily thinking about suicide. Probably sheer luck that he didn't do it. There is a Gustav Herling, a writer later in his life, who was in his 20s when the Germans invaded in Poland. And Herling, established one of the first resistance groups in Poland. Somewhat later, he was arrested by the Red Army and sent to Gulag. But miraculously, he managed to survive. And later, he moved to Naples, where he lived several decades until his death. But for the first time, he came to the Bay of Naples in March 1944, while he was fighting in the so-called Anders Army of Free Poland. When he came for the first time to the Bay of Naples, he came at the moment when there was a major eruption of the Mount Vesuvio going on. And later he attested in November 1980 an earthquake that hit Naples very hard. And in the end of 70s, he attested a so-called slow-motion earthquake in the northern shore of the Bay of Naples. Slow motion meaning that there was minor earthquakes every day, perhaps dozens of earthquakes, little earthquakes every day, and this continued from day to day. And as I have several times stayed in Naples or around, I remember having met people who lived this through. They told that in the morning, when you opened the door of your house, you never knew if there was 3 steps to the street or 1 steps to the street or no steps at all. The terrain was going up and down, moving up and down every day. And everyone who could afford or had a place where to go had left. And in the end, those who remained were forcibly evacuated from Pozzuoli, which was the kind of epicenter of the slow motion earthquake. The town was closed. It was a no-go zone. And it was left under the mercy of the elements. Another character in the book is a Finnish poet, Gunnar Björling. Marguerite Perloff said about his work that it's a milestone in the annals of the poetry or experimental poetry of the 20th century. And Björling lost a major part of his life work during one night. In one night. That was in February 1944, when the Russians were bombing Helsinki, and the house where Björling lived was hit by several bombs. And during the following 2 weeks, Björling returned daily to the ruins, to the still flaming ruins, trying to find any scrap of paper that could have still found. And he found, actually, he found his parts of his manuscripts, but the pages were blackened and shrinked because of the immense heat of the explosions. And he tried to read them with magnifying glass and managed to distinguish, recognize one word here, another there, and then tried to guess or imagine the rest. And he said later that he was trying to listen the voice of ash. Then in the book there is a narrator who, after a minor accident in his cottage in the eastern border of Finland next to Russia, decides to follow the invitation of his lifelong friend to come to Rome to see him. His friend Mara had been a rising star of the Finnish Wittgenstein school of philosophy until he decided to quit philosophy and abandon it completely and move to Rome. where he has met, as the narrator learns, an undocumented Ethiopian who is illegally in Rome and who wants to get over the border to Switzerland or anywhere out of Rome, anywhere out of Italy, where his conditions could be a bit better. And yes, there is in the novel also a Swedish doctor, Gunnar Agge, who participates to the so-called Red Cross ambulance or Red Cross medical expedition to Ethiopia during the Italian-Abyssinian War in 1935-36, and who attested widely spread use of the mustard gas against the civilian population, the Ethiopians, by the Italian air forces, which deliberately bombed also the Red Cross hospital in the desert of southern Ethiopia. And all these characters, on the first side, have very little to do with each other, converge somehow, their paths cross, their traces cross, their lives fade, their struggle to survive has something common. Even everyone is living the struggle in his own way. But somehow, at least in a thematic way, they somehow belong around the same table. This is a metaphor, they don't necessarily meet in the novel. Pardon. And in a way, if you wish, there's even something more struggling for survival, at least in the discussions of the narrator and his friend. Especially the friend is obsessively speaking about how thinking is disappearing, how everything intelligent, everything that requires even a little bit of thinking is pushed away out of sight, everywhere the same. And the friend says that this is already a part of our form of life. And if thinking wouldn't be pushed away from sight, a person like the undocumented Ethiopian and everyone like him, or everyone in a similar situation, wouldn't be pushed away from sight. I'm going to read you an extract in Finnish, just to give an idea how the original Finnish sounds. And in this extract, the narrator is with his friend Mara, who is referring to the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he's referring to the Finnish poet Gunnar Björling, and he's referring to the undocumented Ethiopian he has met. And out of the blue, kind of common associations, or even a common logic in between these three characters is beginning to accelerate in Mara's mind. In Finnish, we have a saying that someone's sauna is burning. It means that the someone heats and overheats the sauna until the whole sauna house bursts into flames. And something similar is here happening with Mara, according to the narrator. Mara ei sortteerannut ihmisiä, sitä ne Wittgensteinit, Björlingit ja sedät. Mara ei sietänyt sitä, että johonkin paperittomaan suhtaudutaan kuin surkeaan ja heikkoon ihmiseen vain siksi, että tämä on avun tarpeessa. Mara ei sortteerannut ihmisiä edes sellaisella huomaamattomalla tavalla, että tietyt ja tietynlaiset ihmiset kuuluvat yhtäälle ja toiset ja toisenlaiset kuuluvat toisaalle. Ja vaikka kaivopuiston rantsusta tiesin, että puhuttiin mistä hyvänsä, Mara vertasi kaikkia asioita aina samoihin Björlingeihin ja Wittgensteineihin. Itse asiassa useimmat asiat, jotka Maran puheissa jäivät mieleen etiopialaisista, jäivät mieleen juuri näiden toisten vuoksi. Björling eli vuosia ja vuosikymmeniä täysin mahdottomassa umpikujassa, kuten Mara nyt sanoi etiopialaisesta. Mara puhui Björlingistä aina, kun kaivopuiston rannassa lähestyimme harmaanruskeaksi rapattua rakennusta, jossa Björling oli asunut alun perin saunaksi tarkoitetussa 24 metrin kokoisessa asunnossa, johon oli sisäänkäynti suoraan ulkoa. Ja vaikka juuri nyt Mara ei montaa sanaa Björlingistä sanonutkaan, jäin ajattelemaan Björlingiä samalla kun hän jatkoi siitä etiopialaisestaan. Kuuntelin Maran puheita ja ajattelin samalla etiopialaista, ja tosiasiassa Maran puheista asti Björling ja se etiopialainen ovat pysyneet mielessäni ikään kuin yhdessä. Ainoa todellinen mittari ajatuksille on niiden rohkeus, Mara sanoi, koska kaiken ajattelun tarkoitus on auttaa kärpänen pois kärpäspullosta, kuten Wittgenstein kirjoitti, eli muuttaa täysin mahdottomia olosuhteita.
My name's David Hackston. I'm a British translator of Finnish and Swedish literature, mostly Finnish. And so that's something I've been doing now for perhaps around 23 years. And in that time, I've translated, I think, around 30 novels and a number of plays, a dozen or so plays. Many genres are included in that sort of catalogue of work. Lots of crime fiction, because of course, as a genre, it's very popular, particularly in the UK, where I do most of my work. And then also lots of literary fiction, notably 3 novels by Paitim Statovci, which have been very successful in the United States and the UK. And then recently, this novel that we're going to talk about today, which is Kari Hukkila's novel called 1001. Here it is in the English, and this is what the Finnish looks like. Kari has talked about it in his own section of this video, and he's given a little reading. So I'll say some words about it, and then I will also do a short reading, maybe a slightly longer reading than he did, but starting at the same point. Normally when I'm asked to translate something, it's very often the publisher who contacts me and asks me if I'm interested in translating something or if I have time to do so. It's not very often that the translator gets to recommend things independently because, well, publishers, of course, they have a different perspective on what they like to publish. If it's more of a business, and of course they have different considerations. So it's very rare that, yes, that I'm ever in a way sort of consulted in that manner. This project was interesting in that Kari himself contacted me and said, well, I've set up this agreement with a publisher who I know in New York, and would you be interested in translating? And I must admit that this was, I think, the very first Corona summer, 2020. He sent me a copy of the book, and I must admit that I had not actually heard of him before that point. So that's my own ignorance, of course. But anyway, I looked at the novel and thought, well, in fact, this would be something that would be really interesting to translate because it's unlike anything I'd worked on before. And it's a novel in which not only from a philosophical perspective, the ideas are very dense and well crafted, but also the language itself presents, from a translation point of view, the language is interesting and very challenging, not least because of the often very long sentences and long paragraphs, which is curious because this is not a feature of much written Finnish. But maybe that's a comment on the state of Finnish letters in general, that authors tend to favor very short sentences and with only main clause so and so did this, full stop. Somebody else did this, full stop. And it can become very sort of staccato in a way. And whereas Kari does the opposite, he writes very, very long sentences and paragraphs that often go on for several pages, because there's a flow to the text, a sort of, you could say, well, Joycean. It's not a stream of consciousness, but a kind of stream of linguistic playing with the language, and teasing out teasing out an idea and then developing it all within the same paragraph. And so I thought, when I looked at the novel, I thought, well, this is something that from a translator's perspective would be most interesting to work on, and indeed it certainly was. So then it took several years until we actually got around to the business of doing the translation. There was a sample translation that was published, I think, a year before the full translation, which was nice because it was a shorter chunk of the text, and that gave us a chance to work together on finding the language in English. Because I often find if I'm working with a writer whose books that I know very well, for instance, there's a crime writer here called Antti Tuomainen, and I'm currently translating this is the 8th novel by him that I've translated. So in a way, I already know when I receive the book how it's going to sound in English. But it's always difficult when you start working with a novelist that you've never encountered before, or that you've never worked with before, because you have to create the language again in English, and that takes time at the beginning, and especially when it's a novelist who really pays great attention to the minutiae of the language, as Kari does. He's published at least one collection of essays, and I think you can tell that he has a background as an essayist, because perhaps the novel has elements of the sort of cultural essay. Again, sort of very, in a sense, very philosophical, taking a topic and, as I said earlier, teasing it and extrapolating it the way that you would in a sort of cultural essay. So those are some of the immediate challenges. One particular challenge is that the novel's written in a very musical fashion. And so, for instance, Kari has chosen certain words, certain, should I say, less conventional words, or words that really stick out from the body of the text, and then they reappear at certain junctures throughout the 200-page span of the prose, often in slightly different contexts. And this, of course, lends a very, I might say, almost operatic sense to the text, kind of as sort of little leitmotifs that run through the body of the text. But then, of course, that's difficult from the translator's point of view, because words can be translated, but then they don't necessarily hold the same selection of subsidiary meanings that they do in one language as they do in another. So where you might have a double meaning in Finnish, that double meaning doesn't necessarily exist in English. And yet, if this is the word that has been singled out to be as the leitmotif, as the musical element that repeats, then that's something that's very challenging for the translator, because you somehow have to think of a way of drawing these different contexts together and using a word that will stand out from the rest of the text. It can't be a word that's particularly ordinary, because Kari has chosen to use words that are extraordinary. So yeah, that's some one of the difficulties that I encountered with this text. Another thing is that a lot of the elements of history, a lot of the people mentioned, real philosophers who really lived. Of course, Wittgenstein is. People will be familiar with Wittgenstein more widely, but then these Finnish philosophers, not necessarily so. So, in fact, for the first time ever, in any translation that I've done, we decided to judiciously use some footnotes just to explain who people are, because I think if you're reading a novel that's already quite difficult or challenging, and then you're presented with a lot of names that really don't mean anything to you, then it's going to make it all the more arduous, actually, and you won't. So these little signposts, these little footnotes, I think help us as we go along. Also, there are little chunks of text in different languages, and so they all have their own little footnote, just so that the reader can stay on track, as it were. So I think it's high time I gave you a little example of what all this sounds like. So I will read, I believe Kari, well, he told me which section he started reading, so I'll start reading from the same section and then carry on. Mara didn't sort people, just as the Wittgensteins, Björlings, and uncles of the world didn't sort people either. Mara couldn't stand the way we think of illegals as poor, pathetic souls just because they're in need of help. Mara didn't even sort people inadvertently, such that people like so-and-so belong over here, while people like such and such belong over there, to the extent that I knew from our walks along the shore at Kaivopuisto that, no matter what we were talking about, Mara would always compare everything to the Björlings and the Wittgensteins. And in fact, most of what I remember he told me about the Ethiopian, I remember specifically because of these two men. Björling spent years, decades, living in a hopeless, dead end, which is what Mara now said about the Ethiopian. When we were walking along the shore at Kaivopuisto, Mara would always talk about Björling whenever we approached the house, plastered in grey and brown, where Björling had lived in a small space originally intended as a sauna, and where the door opened directly outside. And though right now Mara didn't have much to say about Björling, my thoughts remained with the poet as Mara continued telling me about the Ethiopian. I listened to Mara's stories and thought about the Ethiopian. And in fact, in the course of Mara's story, Björling and the Ethiopian always appeared in my mind in tandem. The only real measure of thoughts is their courage, said Mara, because the aim of all thought is to help the fly out of the fly bottle, as Wittgenstein wrote. That is, to alter a set of impossible circumstances. The objective of thought is to help someone out of their provincial condition, regardless of whether that meant changing country or changing one's own spiritual conditions. Mara often said, and because one usually pours a drop of beer into the bottom of a fly bottle to lure the flies in, then the comparison with the provincial condition rings true, right down to the beer. When a fly flies into a fly bottle, it tries to find its way out, to liberate itself from its glass-walled prison. And precisely because it's in such a panic to set itself free, it flies into the glass walls over and over again, unable to turn around and change direction. Ludde, that's Wittgenstein, thought that a person shut away in a cell would behave in much the same way. If there is a row of fake doors in front of him, he will grab onto the same doorknobs over and over again, unable to turn around, even if the real door is behind him. Björling didn't rest his hand on the fake doorknob, said Mara, and I'd recognized when I was younger that Björling was plagued by the prevailing provincial condition, perhaps more than anyone else in Finland. From one decade to the next, people said they couldn't understand his poetry, which naturally implied that there was nothing in his poetry to understand in the first place. Though almost all his poems, particularly those deemed so unfathomable, are poems that help the fly out of the bottle and back into a normal, natural life. Björling teaches us everything about normal, natural thought, said Mara, though it was this very quality that meant that over the years and decades he'd ended up with a bloody nose time and again. Björling's poetry was derided as impossible to understand, though in fact it's very Unbegriplighet, its unintelligibility, is a synonym for normal and natural life, because it is this same normal and natural life that is for most, if not all people, the hardest and most unintelligible thing of all, said Mara. For years and decades, Björling's poems were considered unintelligible by the very people whose judgment was respected the most in Finland, said Mara. The very people whose common sense was held in high regard wrote that Björling was deranged, and there's no doubt that these same people's supposed common sense garnered a great many plaudits too. It's probably because of Björling that I feel such sympathy for the Ethiopian, though he put me in a terrible bind just when I had plenty of other things to worry about, Mara continued. What applies to Björling applies to the Ethiopian too. People are suspicious of him too. They reject him, don't want to understand him. He too is obegriplig, and his life and existence are completely obegripliga. In fact, his life and existence are living synonyms for the word obegriplig. And whenever people say they cannot understand something, what they actually mean is they don't want to or don't have the slightest intention of understanding it, said Mara, just as Björling's poems weren't actually obegripliga at all. But people had decided that they didn't want or didn't care to understand him, even if he'd written the simplest things imaginable, as quite frankly he normally did. I was half listening to Mara, whose rant was escalating into full-scale fulmination, as it were, and I thought to myself that there was in fact one occasion in Björling's life when his poems became quite literally unintelligible, as Mara had a habit of pointing out. That's quite a long reading at the moment, just to point out that the word obegriplig means unintelligible. But it's an example of the style that Kari uses throughout this novel, which is that he'll take a word and then, in a way, musically repeat it throughout an entire section. And it lends the prose a sort of a rhythm of its own, which is very nice, and which hopefully I've been able to capture in this reading, perhaps not. Anyway, I hope you find this interesting, and I hope also that you find the entire book or interesting enough to pick up the book at all reputable bookstores and read it and see for yourself how you get on with this very long sentences, long paragraphs, etc. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Gianluca Rizzo, and here with me is Dominic Siracusa.
Hello everybody.
And together we translated Ugo Tognazzi's The Injester, published by Contra Mundum Press. So for the next half hour or so, we will talk about this remarkable and unusual little book. We'll give you an overview of its contents, read a few extracts, and give you a glimpse in the process of editing and translating it.
And then about halfway through, we'll turn the video over to the actor Vincent Piazza, who has generously agreed to read one of the many entertaining anecdotes contained in our book. So stay tuned for that. First, though, I think we need to talk a little bit about Ugo Tognazzi's Injester itself.
Absolutely. But first things first, I think we want to thank a few people that brought us together today. And so without whom this video, this presentation wouldn't have happened. And so thank you, Marianne Newman, for inviting us to participate to this wonderful festival. And then we would like to thank Alexandra Gold and Gabriele Tinti for putting us in touch with Vincent Piazza, and naturally Rainer Hanschi for bringing this project together and publishing the book through Contra Mundum Press. So thank you all for all your work on this. Okay, so let's talk about the book then. Where should we start?
I think maybe it's probably best we start with the man himself, Ugo Tognazzi. Can you tell us a little bit about his background?
Yep. So Ugo Tognazzi was an Italian actor, a very well-known one. Everybody in Italy is familiar with his work. He was in the theater. He worked for the movies. He was on Italian TV. In fact, that's where most Italians might remember him from. After World War II, with Raimondo Vianello, he formed a very successful comedic duo. And then they worked on TV on a number of programs. But in the movies, he worked with the most famous actors and directors of his generation. So anyone that was somebody in post-World War II cinema worked with him. Pasolini, you name it, he worked with them. But he also had another aspect to his public persona. He was a bon vivant. He was known as somebody who knew how to have fun, to enjoy life. And in this capacity, he was a frequent guest on the radio, on TV, and magazines, where he acted as a sort of culinary expert. And I think part of the reason why he was seen this way is because of the role he played in Marco Ferreri's 1973 film La Grande Bouffe, where he plays the role of an aging, bitter, and suicidal chef. I mean, we won't give away the plot of the movie. You guys should watch it. But in fact, the title Injester is connected to La Grande Bouffe, right?
Yeah, in fact, it is. So in Italian, the title is abbuffone, which is an actual word in the Italian language, not a made-up word like the English translation for the title of our book. It contains a reference to the verb abbuffarsi, which means to gorge oneself. So, as well as to the title of the French film La Grande Bouffe. So, also as well, it has in Italian the movie, which the movie was translated into Italian as La Grande Abbuffata, which we'll touch more on this later, right? And the title also contains buffone, which means jester, as in the court jester.
Yep. And so basically, the title puts together the ideas of excessive eating, and then the entertainment in the traditions of both the court jester, the fool, and cinema, right? And I think, that's really, I think, the key element of the whole movie. The thread that brings it all together is the connection between entertainment and food. You could call it conviviality, which is really what happens when people gather around the table. They share food, but also they discuss recipes, they compare notes. And if they are Italians, they start arguing on the best way that, say carbonara should be done. We'll talk about this.
Which we'll talk about, yes.
And that's, already quite the entertainment right there. But then in addition to this, usually people start swapping anecdotes, memories of, when they were together the last time and when they worked with such and such person. And this is really what the book that Tognazzi put together is about. It's his experiences, but also his recipes. And he does explain this in the preface, does he not?
He does. He does.
Let's turn to it and read straight from the preface.
All right. So the book is divided into 3 sections. The first, which I entitled Autogastrobiography, includes a series of memories that deal with different times in my life, from the furthest away to the most recent. Starting from autobiographical premises, I wanted to write a few tranches de vie in which, as it often happens in everyday life, food is present in one way or another. To a gastronome like me, talking about myself through food was the best way, perhaps the only way, to build a narrative. The second part is comprised of the easiest of my recipes. I love simple cooking, the kind that doesn't take too much time, even though I'm a stickler for details and a perfectionist, even when it comes to making spaghetti with butter or frying an egg. I warn you that you might already know some of these recipes, also because I divulge many of them every week through the microphones of the Gran Varietà. But I'm certain you'll discover something more, or maybe less, or just different, that will help perfect, if might say so myself, their execution and therefore the final products. The third part and final part of the book is devoted to the Grand Bouffe, the big feast, and the recipes for the dishes shown in the film. A dazzling finale of fireworks that won't fail to satisfy your imagination and, most of all, your palate.
Excellent. So that's Tognazzi himself describing the contents of his book, right? So that's to give you an idea of what's in it. But I think we can do better than that. So we thought we'd share with you one of the great anecdotes from the book. One that is about how to cook enough carbonara for over 300 people gathered for a party in New York City.
And supposedly Tognazzi does it all on his own, right?
Well, with the help of
Orca-
friends, right? But he's in charge for sure.
He orchestrated the whole thing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so,
So for this section, we're going to turn to a professional, and that is the actor Vincent Piazza, who has generously agreed to read this passage for us, a very entertaining passage. Again, we are very grateful to him for his time and for lending us his skills. So without further ado, let's turn to him. And after Vincent reads, Gianluca and I will be back with more insights into our translation.
sounds great.
1964, an American carbonara. 20 years from now, when I look back on my acting career, maybe I'll have one regret. Not giving it up to become the greatest chef in America, perhaps the world. It's a fairly straightforward story, but I'm sure you'll find it entertaining. In any case, I'll have fun retelling it. The appointment was in New York City, in a suite on the 48th floor of the Hilton Hotel, for the official press conference for the release of the film The Wedding March. It was going to be a party for 350 people. The idea for the main event came from the Italian producer, who suggested that I cook pasta for everyone. The main actor of the movie was going to cook the main course of the evening. The Americans were excited by the idea, while I almost fainted. It's not that I don't like cooking pasta. I wouldn't mind doing it from morning to night, but I had never cooked for 350 people before. Like a general preparing for battle, I immediately wanted to scope out the terrain, that is, the suite. It consisted of 5 large rooms, each furnished in a different style. Naturally, I paid little attention to the furniture, as my focus was the kitchen. I found it in the very back, and it wasn't small at all. There was a fridge as big as a wardrobe, and a stove with 6 burners. I checked each burner, examined the pots, quickly checked on the crowd with its martinis. I ventured a quick estimate. They could only eat pasta in turns, in groups of 30. We would be there until 8 a.m. the next morning. That wasn't dinner. That was murder. I asked about the hotel's kitchen. They brought me down there in the elevator. To their surprise, I timed how long the elevator took to get from the 48th floor to the ground. 56 seconds exactly. The New York Hilton's kitchen lived up to the reputation of this great hotel chain. I immediately examined the pots. They weren't pots, they were pools. I told them to fill them with water, and I poured in 4 or 5 pounds of salt before jumping back in the elevator. On the way up, it took an extra second to arrive. I returned to the guests in order to study them for a bit. Most of them were American. Hopelessly American. I had to decide what kind of spaghetti to make. I made a quick mental survey of all kinds of pasta options to figure out which would be best suited to those Yankee palates. I immediately eliminated spaghetti with basil and tomato because they could have mistaken it easily for pizza. I didn't have time for ragu, which after all wouldn't have been a novelty for them. I scrapped amatriciana out of concern for the taste of American canned tomatoes. By exclusion, I finally arrived at carbonara. Carbonara might have just done the trick. That's because it is the sauce that most resembles the American taste. It is made of sautéed bacon and scrambled eggs. Where could you find anything more genuinely American than that? Naturally, I wasn't going to stop there. I would add some heavy cream, which Americans put on everything, and finally a bit of alcohol, which, given all those martinis they'd been drinking, would have fit right in. What is pasta, in the end, if not processed grains? And isn't American toast the same thing? We Italians see pasta as a mysterious and magical product, a miraculous food that God Almighty sent down to earth to make up for the many deficiencies of our country. But in the end, if you really think about it, it's nothing but bread done in a different way. And please, don't tell me that pasta was invented by the Chinese, because even though that's true that they gave us the first spaghetti, they've been coasting ever since. And all you get from them is a boiled whitish little spaghetti as a side. On the other hand, we Italians, thanks to Neapolitan street smarts, cunning, and imagination, have developed a dizzying array of pasta forms, like fireworks: orecchioni, fusilli, penny, farfalle, lumaconi, ziti, mezzi ziti, zitoni, bucatini, rigati, rigatoni, canolicchi, and so on. Well, but let's get back to New York. There I was, about to cook a typical Italian dish that seemed tailor-made for America. When the producer saw my smile, he realized that I had made up my mind. Now began my battle against the clock. It was truly a chrono carbonara, because the central problem of the whole operation was, don't let the pasta overcook. Get it from the kitchen to the 48th floor, sauce it, and serve it al dente, which is why I had timed it exactly how long the elevator took to get up to our floor. I also had to factor in the 10 seconds it would take to transfer it from the service elevator. The kitchen was 4 floors below in the basement. In the meantime, the cooks had diced 10 pounds of bacon, 250 eggs, and 100 additional yolks had been whisked and were nervously waiting to join the sautéed bacon. The whole thing would then be poured over 60 pounds of spaghetti, on top of which 10 pounds of grated Parmigiano would be dusted, while 4 pounds of cream and 10 shots of cognac would top it all off. I knew from experience that the type of spaghetti chosen for that evening had a cook time of 11 minutes. When after my signal, 60 pounds of spaghetti divided into 6 portions of 10 pounds each were thrown into 6 pots of boiling water. The clock read, I still remember, precisely 9:31 p.m. At 9:40, very nervously, I gave the command, "Drain pasta." The 60 pounds of spaghetti were being drained as a phone call confirmed that, in the meanwhile, the condiments, that is the sautéed bacon, eggs, cream, Parmigiano, and cognac, had safely reached the 48th floor. At 9:40 and 12 seconds, we left the kitchen riding the elevator to the ground floor. At 9:40 and 31 seconds, we entered the elevator, headed up to the 48th floor. That ride lasted forever. At 9:41 and 25 seconds, we entered the suite where 6 stainless steel food warmers awaited us, steaming. In 10 seconds, the pasta was transferred into those 6 containers. In 20 seconds, it was sauced by an army of very nervous cooks under my unflinching and by now crazed supervision. At 9:42 on the dot, I gave the signal to charge. And while the 350 guests rushed in, I flopped onto a rather uncomfortable Louis XV. The pasta Olympics were over. Perhaps a world record had been broken, but was it worth it? How did that industrially prepared carbonara taste? I started hearing some of the guests say while eating, "Terrific." My English is not that good, but I knew that terrific is close to terrificante, terrifying. I felt like a piece of sautéed bacon. I was sweating. I didn't know that terrific can also mean fantastic. Luckily, later on, I started to also hear fantastic, fabulous, marvelous, wonderful, divine, shocking, etc. All you could hear was people chewing. In 10 minutes, they polished off 60 pounds of pasta. At this point, the producer came looking for me and found me hidden behind a velvet curtain. Then he introduced me. "Here's the author of tonight's dish." He barely finished the sentence when somebody was already patting my back. They started hugging me amidst squeals, laughter, and cheers. I got about 100 kisses greased with bacon. They kept at it for at least another 10 minutes. In the meantime, however, The producer tried to clarify the situation. He's not a professional cook, he explained nervously. He's an actor. He's the film's protagonist. Really? The guests asked politely. But you could tell they didn't care either way. All they wanted to talk about was that terrific carbonara. And they would try to pronounce the name, mangling it. Carbonara? And after a little while, the whole room echoed, Carbonara. My carbonara became infamous in a matter of days. And I began a tour that took me to Oklahoma, Dallas, and New Orleans. Not so much to promote the movie as to cook my triumphant dish in the homes of the richest Americans. One evening, as I was giving an equally successful performance in the villa of the owner of a big supermarket chain, she quickly asked me, Mr. Tognazzi, why don't you come to America? You could make a name for yourself in America. Everybody would know who you are. And I said, I would love that if only. I already pictured myself in Hollywood doing movies with Shirley MacLaine. And she said, so come, and I'll open a chain of fabulous restaurants for you. We'll make a ton of money. It'll be a huge success. You'll be known as the greatest chef in the world. Movies are hard. Carbonara is easy. My carbonara. Spaghetti carbonara. Ingredients for 6 people. 1 pound of thin spaghetti, 1 cup of heavy cream, 6 eggs minus 3 whites, 1/3 pound of bacon, 1/4 pound of prosciutto, lean and fat, 3½ tablespoons of butter, 1/4 pound of grated Parmigiano, 4½ tablespoons of pecorino, chili flakes, cognac or brandy. You beat the 6 yolks and 3 whites in a bowl. Add the cheeses, the heavy cream, salt and pepper, and mix well. Sauté the bacon, and after a little while, add the prosciutto. Both bacon and prosciutto cubed. Drain the pasta when al dente, mix in the butter, then add the egg sauce, and finally the sautéed meats. The final touch is the cognac, half a shot. If it's too runny, put it back on the stove for 10 seconds.
Welcome back, everyone. And thank you, Vincent, for that wonderful reading and for giving voice to our translation.
Yeah, so that's a great anecdote. I think we picked a good one. So now, what's your favorite part of that story that Tognazzi tells us?
Oh, I mean, there's so many great things happening in this story. But what I love about it is its comedic tone. I really think that if somebody took this story, they could make their own very funny little short film out of it. I think it's that rich.
Yeah.
What about you? What's your favorite part?
I think a set of characters, right, with all the guests and the cooks and the setting, I think it would make a great short movie. I also
Yeah.
think, you touch on something, meaning the whole story revolves around this idea of timing. So it needs to, the pasta needs to get there, the certain degree of,
Yeah, timing the elevators for the different floors so it's not overcooked or undercooked. Mhm.
And don't comedians always say that in comedy timing is all, right?
That's true.
And
That's
pasta
true.
cooking timing is all too. So I think
That's true. The
that,
two themes seem to really overlap well here. Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So the tone, absolutely, the timing aspect. The other thing that grabbed my attention is the punchline, right? At the end, that's a device that Tognazzi often uses in his own storytelling. He sets it up, and then, like a consummate actor, he has to have a way to leave the stage and play himself off, as it were. And so the punchline is usually the way he does it. But let me ask you, so Tognazzi presents a recipe of carbonara that is not exactly the traditional one, is it?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think that the thing that's his touch there is the cognac or brandy at the end. I don't know. I've never made
Also the
that
cream. I mean, the cream part of it,
cream.
I don't know if many Italians would agree with that sort of use of cream.
That's true. That's true. I mean, how do you prepare your carbonara?
Well, so
Being from southern Italy.
right. I mean, this is, we were saying earlier, you want to start a fight, how you make your carbonara, and then you get a fight, right? But so the first divide is bacon guanciale, right? That's the first sort of
Yeah.
And as Yogi Berra said, at the fork in the road, take it. So I don't have any preference. I go with whatever is available.
Whatever's in front of you, it looks good, right? Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing, I think rather I wouldn't use cream. I would use pecorino instead of the parmigiano to sort of more, oomph to
And
that.
that's very Romano of you to use pecorino. I think that everybody in Rome would agree with you. Yeah.
And then the other thing is, this has been seen in many of those cooking shows, but rather than cream, you can use the cooking water of pasta in order to make it a little creamier and to sort of make it a little lighter at the same time. But the issue there is he's cooking for so many people that I don't know, how this sort of home recipe would fare in those large quantities.
And riding up and down the elevator, right?
Right. So what about you? What's your recipe?
I'm with you. I'm in that the cream. I don't think I would ever use the cream. I actually prefer, and I made this last night in preparation for this video. I prefer the Roman spaghetti alla gricia, which is basically carbonara without the egg or without any cream content.
Right.
So it's pecorino, onions, guanciale or pancetta, and maybe a little bit of butter, but I don't think the Romans would agree with me on that. But with my recipe, I put a little butter at the end, so it really coats the bucatini when I toss everything together.
Oh, that's the whole.
That's
ones. What kind of pasta you use, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We didn't touch on the type of pasta, but yeah.
But
so,
the other, as I was listening to you and we were talking about bacon and so on, the other bit that is very controversial here is the origin of the recipe, right?
Correct.
Then it's with the US.
Supposedly, I mean, my cousin in Rome loves to tell this story that carbonara was invented after the American troops landed in Rome. That there were two American guys cooking bacon and eggs out in the open at the barracks, and then an Italian guy came up and threw bucatini or spaghetti or whatever it was into the mix, and then you had voila, carbonara. So it's this mix of Italian and American cultures meeting after World War II. How much truth there is in that, I don't know.
Well, if it's not true, it's well found, right? That's the Bruno's famous maxim: "Se non è vero, è ben trovato." So, okay, so we talked about the recipe, how we make it, the history of it. The connection with the US though is deeper than that, right? Meaning, yes, the World War II sort of story legend that you just recounted, but also Tognazzi seems to think that carbonara is particularly well suited for the American audience, right? Why do you think that is?
Well, he has this idea of Americans like eating bacon and eggs every morning, and so that's the dish that they will find most palatable, rather than, I don't know, a ragu or even aglio olio peperoncino, which would be a simple dish and easy to make for 300 people. But he feels that bacon and eggs, something with bacon and eggs, will be amusing to the American audience.
Yeah.
And so for that jab, right, that jab that he takes at Americans, we tried to give it a little bit of levity when it came time to translate the title of the recipe itself, right?
Yeah, so this is something that is very common in general in Italian culture, especially around those years when he's writing. Italians have a very sort of the idea, the vision that they have of America is through movies. And we were just talking earlier about Un Americano a Roma, Alberto is in this movie, a moviegoer that is extremely enthusiastic about American movies, so much so that he thinks of himself as an actor playing an Italian within reality in Rome. And so he moves around the cityscape as if he were in an adventure or in a sort of action movie where, the bad guys are after him and so on. And he has a way of speaking also, which is he tries to reproduce the way an American English speaker would say Italian words, right? Which is what you were referring to in the carbonara recipe.
Because we translate it as care bone era,
Right.
right? Because Tognazzi, as you heard in Piazza reading the story, that everybody was mispronouncing carbonara when they were congratulating him on a successful dinner
Terrific.
at the party.
Yeah.
Yeah, terrific. Terrific. Yes. Exactly.
But we should also say, I wouldn't want people to come away thinking, oh, this is criticism, or Tognazzi is looking down on Americans or American audience. I don't think that's it at all. I think it's just this very sort of idea of American culture filtered through movies, and the encounters that people would have through, TV or radio. Whenever an famous American actor would come to Rome to work, they would exchange a few words with the press, and that's what they heard. That's what people heard on the radio.
Yeah.
And TV.
But also part of the comedy of linguistic fumbles, right? You think of another famous Italian actor, Roberto Benigni's performance in Jim Jarmusch's movie Down by Law, where he's getting chased. They break out of jail. He's getting chased by dogs, and he starts reciting his mother's recipe on how to cook chicken, right? And it's linguistically it's hilarious because it's this beautiful mix of Italian and English, and I think this scene reminded me of that in Down by Law.
Now, in a pinch, it's always good to turn to Mama's recipes.
Turn to Arreggi the dog. Arreggi the dog.
Yeah. Okay, so I want us to move on, but I want to point out one last feature of this anecdote that I found interesting, and that is something that Tognazzi does throughout the book, which is he has a very sort of authoritarian, shall we call it, approach to food and cooking and the presence, his own presence in the kitchen and as a cook, right? And so I think I thought we could turn to this one passage from the preface again, where he really lays it out, quite transparently how he sees his own role within the kitchen. And so we are on page 5, and he says, "As I indulge in this love of food, I suffer neither middlemen nor rules. I am the creator of the scene and its performer, the deity that transforms the inert words of a recipe into a flavorful and colorful reality, harmonizing and measuring the ingredients, sensing even emotionally when things are perfectly cooked, participating viscerally in the frying of potatoes, suffering with garlic in boiling oil, rejoicing in soffritto, basking in every sauce, losing myself in the smells and aromas, loving the tiny leaf of basil that was just pickled, sacrificed on a mound of steaming macaroni in tomato sauce. My cooking is artistic," and so on and so forth. I mean, he goes on for a while. But this is to give you an idea. He, when he invited you over for lunch, and should you be so lucky, that was his show. And then your role was clearly the one of the audience.
Exactly. But so that's one of the many threads that runs through this book. But also, the book is a very personal and intimate tale, right? Of Tognazzi's life, his very humble upbringing, right?
Yep. Yeah, so he, life wasn't easy. After the Second World War in Italy, he didn't have it particularly good. He has stories about, he worked in a salami factory for a while as an accountant, of all things, right after World War II. He was living with his mother at the time. He has a few stories about that. And then
even before that is the tale about his grandfather, who was a milk vendor.
Yep.
Who would sell fresh milk every day.
Yep.
And then also then he moved on to become part of the coal business, and he had a helper who they couldn't afford to pay him, so the helper in exchange for working in the coal store. He had soup every night and ate
Remember,
with
yeah,
ate with Tognazzi and his family.
yeah.
So
And I think this all shows also the other aspect of his life. I mean, he is a teller of tall tales. You know, this is
exactly.
his persona, but also you can see beneath that all the life experiences, all the difficulties throughout. You know, it's a way of looking at Italian history of the
Well,
20th.
that's a good point. Yeah,
World War
yeah,
II.
very much so.
Yeah.
He does talk about all the major historical moments, right?
Yep.
Throughout
Absolutely.
his life, and how food plays a role around that.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's one part. So we talked about the first third of the movie, which is these episodes, these anecdotes, these stories, these memories. Then there are the recipes that are usually attached to a memory as well. But then there is a whole third part that has to do with La Grande Bouffe, the movie, right?
Yeah.
How would you characterize that section of the book? What grabbed your attention there?
I think Tognazzi was right in saying that it's the dazzling fireworks at the end of the book. It really is a beautiful insight into the making of that film and the intimate relationship that the actors formed in the filming of the book, or sorry, of the film. And not only that, these outlandish, over the top recipes that really would be right the fireworks on any table,
Yep.
right? Like stuffed pig's head, for example,
Yeah,
right?
that's part of the story too, right? Of the storyline. It is the food, the excessive food that they're there to celebrate in that movie, in that house.
Yeah, these, and also for any film fan, that gives a particular insight also into Ferreri's working process,
Yep.
which I think we'll leave it to the reader to explore, but I think it's essential if you're a fan of his movies to read this section of the
You were
book.
saying earlier, so they shot it, the movie, they shot it chronologically in sequence.
Exactly.
So you were saying when somebody died in the movie,
They actually left the set.
yeah,
Yeah.
which
And
created,
so, and Tognazzi says that you really felt a sense of loss when another person left, and that the actors who remained actually were stressed out as to what they were going to do, because it made them realize that they were next,
right,
right? They
that's
were
right.
the ones who were left to die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful movie, and if you haven't seen it, we definitely recommend it. Okay, so we talked about the third part as well. I think, as a way to sort of put a bow on it and wrap the whole thing up, maybe we can use one last recipe. And
Yeah.
I think, so I'll set it up, Dom, and then you read it. So
Sure.
page 171, it's a recipe. It's probably the easiest recipe in the whole book. It's for strawberries in vinegar. And I think
Correct.
I like it, and it's a good way to end because A, it's easy. B, everybody can do it. It really requires 3 ingredients, strawberries, vinegar, and sugar. But also is another example of the tall tales that Tognazzi likes to tell, because he portrays himself as the one who created this recipe, which I doubt it's true, but I'll leave it to the audience to decide.
Correct. Okay. Strawberries in vinegar. In 1946, every time I went to a restaurant that had strawberries on the menu, I would ask them to bring to the table without any I'd ask them to bring them to the table without any dressing. And then I would tell the waiter, as if joking, "Could you bring me some vinegar?" When I would say vinegar, both the waiter and the owner would think I was crazy and stood there in disbelief, wondering what I was up to. I would splash the strawberries with a teaspoon of vinegar, sprinkle them with sugar, mix them well, then eat them. Almost always the waiters would squint and grimace, but then they got curious, and I would have to let them taste my strawberries. Almost everyone would then admit they were excellent. That's because strawberries cancel out the taste of the vinegar, leaving behind only a bit of acidity. In turn, the vinegar draws out the strawberries' juices, making them softer. Consequently, strawberries finally taste like strawberries. After so many years, I've noticed that this invention of mine is on the menus of many restaurants, which present it as a refined dessert of their own creation. Yet those are the very restaurants where I, while on tour all over Italy, had asked for my strawberries, by now one of the most popular dessert items. I'm surprised they haven't called them strawberries alla Ugo.
There you have it. So another tall tale from Ugo Tognazzi. Well, as we said, the book is The Injester, Contra Mundum Press. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you again for inviting us to this wonderful festival. Have a good one, everybody.
Hope you enjoy the book. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hi, folks. Welcome to this chunk of the festival. I'm Peter Thompson. I'm a translator. I'm going to talk about Amina Said, S-A-I-D. Amina Said, I'm going to talk about the book. Here it is. Marcher sur la terre, she writes in French. The book came out exactly 30 years ago. She has about 20 books. She won 2 prizes, the Charles Vidrac Prize and the Jean Malrieux Prize. She's very important. She's Tunisian, lives in France. As a Maghrebi writer, a North African writer, she's part of something of a tradition of writing about exile and nomadism. So the book is largely that content. It's a bit bleak at times. Marcher sur la terre is sort of the idea of walking the whole earth, and it gives you kind of a global feeling of all mankind. But it comes from her experience and her position as a North African and a self-exiled one. This is the case of many Maghrebi writers. So it's a book of poetry, her 7th book. As I say, there are about 20 books now. I'll show you her picture real quickly, and then I want to read some chunks, but also we got very lucky and have a nice, here we go. There, sorry about that. That's Amina Said. We got a nice précis, a nice description by her of what she's up to in the book. And it's better than anyone else could do. And so I'm going to read that. I had to translate it into English. And then we'll read some poems. I want to read one poem in English first so that you sort of know what we're doing and what she's talking about before I read her statement. So this is the first poem in that book, Marcher sur la terre. The English title of the book is Walking the Earth. And this is coming out from a wonderful translation press, Contra Mundum Press. So here's the first poem in that book. All around, night and dream reigned in primal form. From an uprooted sky, sun and moon were born, shadow, light, and sap. And this desire to create amid fire and tears, the uprooted sky, we are able, you and I, to walk the earth. Let me read her statement. She just wrote this 3 days ago. In Walking the Earth, my 7th book, which opens and closes with the word place, I seek out a place that goes from the personal to the collective, from the intimate to the universal. It is the author's space, but also that of numerous people and characters in the book who go through spaces as much geographic as mental, people who are displaced, uprooted, hounded by wars and disasters, migrants as well as travelers, wanderers, those who merely pass by. The theme of wandering is very present in Maghrebi literature. It is at the same time choice and destiny, departures and returns, all of which create the desire for place. Hence, the image of the writer as forced like a tightrope walker to advance above an abyss. The source also of the impression of betweenness, possibly a privileged situation for any writer. So writing has made possible for me an intermediary position between two worlds, Occident and Orient, and the two shores of the Mediterranean that I belong to, a place without a place, where the feeling of difference while also belonging is reinforced, a space where identity is forged. My belonging to these two worlds both legitimizes the quest for place and generates a proliferation of doubles, shadows, voices, witnesses, angels, those who keep vigil. This quest for place is born of a profound feeling of exile. Isn't any creative person exiled? A nomad, an eternal wanderer seeking a place, a utopia, a place imaginary, impossible, dreamed of, which poetry can, with a sudden flaring, show in an unforeseeable image. A symbolic place, thanks to which any feeling of exile will be abolished, where a being might arrive at a kind of unity. An elsewhere that evokes in us a sense of the sacred, a desire to exceed, to transcendence, an elsewhere that responds to a deeply spiritual separation and merges with the search for self. These poems remain haunted by birthplace, the other shore of the Mediterranean, the original place that links to childhood and irrigates memory. So writing becomes a return to that non-temporal episode which is childhood. Distance from those landscapes perhaps explains their obstinate resurgence through and in my work, as if I'm trying to remain inscribed in them, with memory serving to fill the hollows of absence. And absence, this other name for exile, when it is positive, can open onto a new birth. And she inserts a line from the book, and out of my own absence, I am born to myself. The last paragraph of what she wrote, this place of origin also conserves memories of ancient civilizations born on the other shore, the legends and myths that several poems refer to, while I, the author, remain sensitive to the timeless, the immemorial, all the dimensions of time itself, the dove priestess in the days of Carthage, or the seven sleepers in the cave. Thus, across distances, spatial, temporal, the springs well up again in us because they have been in us always. Memory and writing allow us to preserve the past in the present. The poem becomes a return, even when we are in constant renewal, a renewal which will push us ever forward, willing our motion, for which the book's title also serves as metaphor. the title Walking the Earth. I should point out there is only one other English translation. There's one Spanish translation. The other English translation is not an entire book, a complete book. It's selections. So now I'm going to read some both in French and English. And because not everyone will get the same experience from the French, I'll do a different segment where I read 2 or 3 only in English. Okay. Tous les chemins ramènent au même lieu. Le voyage est cheval d'illusion. Les braises du monde noircissent son pas démesuré. Elles brûlent nos langues inquiètes. En lui-même, le poème se cherche. Il est cette eau noire qui nous éblouit lorsque nous lui restituons une lointaine lueur d'étoiles. The same poem in English. All paths lead to the same place. Journey is illusion's horseback. The world's embers blacken its wanton footstep. They burn our anxious tongues. Within its form, the poem seeks itself. It's this black water that dazzles us when we give it back the far glimmer of a star. La nuit se pose sur le jour. De tous nos yeux, nous regardons la vie. L'amour nous invente et parle le langage des sons. Auréole de silence en avant de nos lèvres nous porte l'écho d'un pays, d'une enfance, cérémonie de la mémoire, d'une mer inconnue. Nous rejoignons la rive. Les vagues séparées dissimulent leur tumulte. Et toujours nous contiendrons la nuit qui tombe en nous, comme un clou noir dans la chair de la chair. Same poem in English. Night settles over the day. We gaze full-eyed upon life. Love invents us and speaks the senses' language. Aureole of silence before our lips, bringing us the echo of a childhood land, the memory ceremony. We regain the shore of an unknown sea. Waves in succession dissemble the heaving, and we will gather always the night falling within us like a black nail into flesh's very flesh. As an experiment, I'm going to read the first one in the book, which we've already had in English. And we can see how much resonance there is if anyone remembers it. I'm going to read it in French too, because I think I have an extra minute. En tout lieu, régnait la nuit, le rêve. En sa première forme, du ciel déraciné naquirent le soleil et la lune, l'ombre et la lumière, et la sève. Et ce désir de créer entre feu et larmes. Le ciel déraciné, nous pûmes, toi et moi, marcher sur la terre. So now, 3 more in English, and that will wrap up this 15-minute segment. In the night, the absent and the separated join again. So says the proverb of free men. They expect from the tree, chance survivor of the day, a measure of fruit nourished by its light. They have the undamaged voice and the incomplete face of the living. Different poem. Thursday or Wednesday at the twilight hour, a stranger, message in hand, will knock at the door. He will dally a moment, splattering ink on the blotter's rose. The stains will form other stains, cultivating a circle. A face under the lamp will rapidly blink. A woman's body will emerge, the one you love, always the same one, always different. And this is our last poem. Radiant day launches the mute cry of its splendor, attentive to what is birthing, breath, day, flame. Over lifeless silence, we lay down a word, which calls forth another word, celebrating the transfigured territory of absence. Our anxious doubles do not yet know how to live in the world. Thanks for listening and being part of the festival.
Hello, everyone, and happy SANT JORDI 2024. Thanks for tuning in. I'm A. Kaiser, poet and translator of Catalan, French, and Spanish, and today I wanted to share with you an excerpt of Lola Anglada y Sarriera's memoir, which I have translated. Lola Anglada y Sarriera, 1892 to 1984, was a boundary-breaking Catalan illustrator and writer who was one of the most important artists of the pre-war period and the first woman to be awarded the Cross of Sant Jordi. Her memoir has been brought together by La Diputació de Barcelona, whose bookstore you can find on Diagonal, but almost at Passeig de Gràcia. In this excerpt from 1914, we find the 20-something budding artist making her way along with other friends, such as Joan Miró, Mela Multermich, and Saba Papaseit. In the family home on the square Santa Ana, I had a small studio in the attic, with 2 windows overlooking the bell towers of the cathedral, the church Santa Maria del Pi, and the beautiful Mirador del Rei Martí on King Square. Its windows were wide open to the great sky, with lovely common swifts and swallows flying madly about when spring came. In this small space, just big enough to fit the drawing board and 2 chairs, is where my work takes flight, with no guidance, relying on only what I myself could muster. In this studio, I create my first original drawings for Catalan publications. Opposite this house, there was still the Spanish Renaissance-style building at the corner. In this building, on the 3rd floor, the painter Francesc Galí had established a drawing and painting academy. The school piqued my interest, and my parents agreed to let me study there. At the academy, I enjoyed the family atmosphere among teachers and students. I remember well and with fondness all who attended: Enric Cristofo Ricard, Heribert Cassan, Ramon Sunyer, Bartomeu Ferran, Banza Balanzó, Hermans, Marianne Espinal, Joan Miró, Joseph Gold, Jalpi, Joplin Joseph Garriga, Mirambé, Joseph Raffles. Our models were most often humble people and gypsies, and never nude. All of us followed the teacher's instructions, adapted his methods. Although I, too, was willing to adapt, the teacher's remarks were encountered to the path that I, in tandem with my intuition, was trying to lay out. Professor Galí, an intelligent man and a solid teacher, and also a great artist, did not take long to tell me. Work and study according to your impulse and personality. You alone will find the way. I thus stopped going to the academy, but my departure didn't mean I didn't appreciate the art and teaching of the artist there and of our good teacher. It's clear that excellent artists were trained in his academy. We can count Professor Gali among the promoters of our contemporary Catalan art, while at the same time, we shouldn't forget his pedagogical contributions. Even as I distanced myself from Gali's academy, the friendships I shared with my colleagues there didn't fall apart. We discussed and argued about art. Saturdays, we attended art exhibits, preferring those at La Sala del Mo del Carrer Portaferrissa and La Iteñas Galleries. Here, we find our friend, the poet Salvat Papassé, always primed on the latest controversy, and who'd always write poems for me.
Everyone, welcome to our roundtable translation and the Me Too movement in East Asia. Today's roundtable is part of this year's SANT JORDI USA Festivals of Books, Roses, and the Arts. We are so grateful to the SANT JORDI USA Festival for hosting us and allowing us to have this important conversation, especially to the help from Mary Ann Newman and her team. My name is Ling Li, and I am an assistant professor of history at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. I will be moderating today's roundtable. So our roundtable consists of 3 speakers, and I will be introducing them one by one. Our first speaker is Jaina Tang. Jaina is a Taiwanese writer, educator, and translator who translates between Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, French, and English. Jaina is currently a board member at the American Literary Translators Association. She received her MFA in creative writing from the New School. Her translation and essays are published in the Paris Review, Latin American Literature Today, AAWW, McSweeney's, and elsewhere. Jaina translated Taiwanese writer Lin Yihan's novel, Fang Siqi's First Love Paradise, a novel, one of the most iconic Me Too movement titles from Taiwan. I also want to mention that this novel will be published by Harper Via on May 21st, 2024. So congratulations, Jaina. And our second speaker today is Alison Markin Powell. Apologies. So Alison is a literary translator, editor, and publishing consultant. Alison received the 2020 Pan America Translation Prize for The 10 Loves of Nishino by Hiromi Kawakami. Alison's other translation includes works by Osamu Dazai, Kanako Nishi, and Ryunosuke Akutagawa. As co-organizer and co-host of the Translating the Future conference, Alison helped to draft the manifesto on literary translation. She is also a founding member of the translator collectives Sadia and Co. and Strong Women Soft Powered. Alison also maintains the database Japanese Literature in English. She teaches literary translation at Hunter College, CUNY. Allison is a translator of Shiori Ito's Black Box, the memoir that sparked Japan's Me Too movement, one of the most well-known Me Too movement titles from Japan. So welcome, Allison. And our last speaker today is Jamie Chang. Jamie is a literary translator. She has translated many well-known works, including Concerning My Daughter by Kim Hae-jin and Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by Cho Nam-jun, among others. Jamie teaches at the Translation Academy at the Literature Translation Institute of Korea. So welcome to our roundtable again. To give you an idea of how our event is organized today, each of our three presenters will do a reading of their translated works. In particular, Jana and Allison will do a bilingual reading. So after the readings, we will save some time to discuss questions that directly concerns translation and the Me Too movement in East Asia. So with that, we will welcome our first speaker, Jana, to do a reading from her forthcoming translated work, Fang Siqi's First Love Paradise, a novel. So welcome, Jana.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for the introduction. And before my bilingual reading, I'll do a very brief introduction about a book. The reason I would translate this book was because the author was attending the same university as I did. And this book came out in 2017, and not long after that, the author was deceased, 3 months after the debut publication of the Chinese version. But the spirits of this book and the importance of this book really changed a lot of things about sexual assault and sexual harassment, and to be able to talk about the topics in educational setting and beyond in the Taiwanese educational setting, and also in Taiwanese society in general. So I thought it's important to bring this book to be in conversation with other books that talks about Me Too movement and about similar topics. My introduction would just be here, and I'll start by reading my English translation first, then my the Chinese original text. And I'll be reading from the very beginning of the novel. Part 1, Paradise. Doty knew the best thing about being a child was that nobody would take her words seriously. She could boast, break her promises, even lie. The things that come out of a child's mouth are often shiny, naked truths. Reacting instinctively out of self-defense, most adults might reassure themselves, what do kids even know? Out of frustration, children learn to tell the truth selectively. This freedom of self-expression is what allows them to grow up. The only time Liu Yiting ever got scolded for something she had said was at a restaurant in a high-rise hotel. These tedious adult gatherings always came with rare, uninteresting delicacies. At this particular meal, a sea cucumber lay on a big porcelain plate like a long turd deep in the toilet that the maid had scrubbed to a brilliant shine. Liu Yiting let the sea cucumber slide in and out of her mouth, and then spit it back on her plate. Soon she was giggling audibly. Her mother asked what was so funny. It's a secret, she replied. When her mother raised her voice and asked again, Liu Yiting said, it's like giving a blowjob. Infuriated, her mother made her stand off to the side as punishment. When Fang Siqi said she wanted to stand next to her friend, Mama Liu softened her tone and turned to exchange pleasantries with Mama Fang. Liu Yiting knew that compliments like, what a well-mannered child your daughter is, were just empty praise. Their families lived in the same apartment building, on the same floor. Yiting often knocked on the Fang family's door in her pajamas and slippers. And no matter what she had in her hands, be it fast food or workbooks, Mama Fang always welcomed her. They often joked that Yiting was like a long-lost daughter. The girls could while away a whole night with just a piece of tissue. They were on the cusp of turning into grown adults, but they never had to hide their stuffed animals from each other. They didn't have to pretend that the only games they cared for anymore were poker and chess. Yiting and Siqi stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. Siqi mouthed, why did you even say that? Yiting silently replied, it just sounded smarter than saying it looked like poop. It would take Liu Yiting many years to understand that using a word you barely understood was absolutely criminal. It was like saying I love you to someone you don't love at all. Siqi pursed her lips, gestured at the boats below, and remarked about how many there were. They were about to return to Kaohsiung port. Each of the whale-like cargo ships was led by a tiny shrimp of a boat. Various big and small boats aligned with each other, squeezing out V-shaped waves. The whole of Kaohsiung port resembled a blue blouse being ironed, smoothed over back and forth. The view made them feel sentimental and sad. They were soulmates who shared the infinite beauty of existence with one another. That's going to be the English part. And I'm going to read the same part from the original. 刘依婷知道，当小孩最大的好处就是没有人会认真看待他的话，他大可吹牛、食言，甚至说谎，也是大人反射性的自我保护。因为小孩最初说的往往是雪亮真言，大人只好安慰自己，小孩子懂什么？挫折之下，小孩从说实话的孩子进化为可以选择说实话的孩子。在话语的民主中，小孩才长成大人。唯一因为说话被责骂的一次，是在饭店高楼的餐厅。大人聚会总是吃一些难得而无聊的食物，海参躺在白瓷大盘里，就像一条屎在阿娜擦的发光的马桶底。刘雨婷在齿间吞吐一下，就吐回盘子，笑得像打嗝停不下来。妈妈问她笑什么，她说是秘密。妈妈提起音量，再问一次，她回答这好像口交。妈妈非常生气，叫她去罚站。房思琪说愿陪她罚。刘妈妈口气软下来，跟房妈妈客套起来。而刘雨婷知道你家小孩多乖啊这一类的句子，甚至连语助词都算不上。一层楼就2户，依婷常常睡衣拖鞋去敲房家的门，无论她手上拿的是素食或作业本，房妈妈都很欢迎，笑得像是房家久未归的游子。一张卫生纸也可以玩一晚上，时值欲转大人的年纪，也只有在对方面前玩绒毛娃娃不害臊，不必假装还看得上的玩具只有扑克牌或棋盘。他们肩并肩站在高楼的落地窗前，思琪用他们的唇语问他：“你刚刚干嘛那样说？”依婷用唇语回答：“这样说起来比说大便什么的聪明。”刘依婷要过好几年才会理解，运用一个你其实并不懂的词，这根本是犯罪，就像一个人心中没有爱去说我爱你一样。思琪挪了挪嘴唇，说：“下面高雄港好多船正入港，每一艘大金货轮前面都有一台小虾米的引航船。”一条条大船、小船，个个排几束 V 字形的浪花，整个高雄港就像是熨斗来回烫一件蓝衣衫的样子。一时间，他们2个人心里都有一点凄迷，成双成对，无限美德。And that's the Chinese version. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Jaina, for this reading. So next, we will invite Allison to do a reading from Shiori Ito's Black Box, the memoir that sparked Japan's Me Too movement. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I also would like to express my gratitude to you, Lynn, for the whole idea for this roundtable was yours to begin with. So we're really happy to be able to have this conversation at SANT JORDI. So I was going to give a little bit of background about my book, the book that I translated. So it differs from Jenna's and Jamie's translations in that this book is a memoir. So this is nonfiction. This book was published by the Feminist Press in 2021 in English translation. And as you can see the original, they have the same cover, basically. But so this book originally was published in Japan in October of 2017. And so this is Shiori Ito's the memoir about, it's not, well, as you'll see from the reading that I do, it's about her experience of sexual assault and the aftermath of it in Japan. And what happened was that, so in May of 2017, Shiori held a press conference in Tokyo in which she came forward and made public her accusations because the prosecution had not progressed. They were, she wasn't really getting anywhere. So she decided to come forward. And that was extremely unusual in Japan. And so that sort of sparked one thing. And then she was already working on the book. And the book came out, as I mentioned, October 2017, which is exactly when the Harvey Weinstein news was breaking in the US. And so that sort of, as we know, that sparked the movement in the US as well as other countries, other Western countries. And because of the sort of coincidence of that in the West versus Japan, Shiori basically became the de facto face of Me Too in Japan. Although, as we'll get to talk about later, it sort of unfolded in different ways in Japan and presumably in other parts of East Asia as well. So I was just going to read a few lines in the original first, and then I was going to read a short passage. This is from the introduction of the book. So I was just going to read a few lines in Japanese. I'm doing the reverse version of what Jenna did. 性暴力は誰にも経験してほしくない恐怖と痛みを人にもたらす。そうしてそれは長い間、その人を苦しめる。なぜ私がレイプされたのか？そこに明確な答えはない。私は何度も自分を責めた。ただ、これは起こったことなのだ。残念ながら起こったことは誰にも変えることができない。And so the same passage, plus a little bit more. Sexual violence causes unwanted fear and pain for all its victims. Our trauma continues for a long time afterward. Why was I raped? There is no definitive answer to this question. I've blamed myself over and over. It's simply something that happened to me. And unfortunately, no one can change what happened. I want to believe this experience isn't in vain. When it happened to me, I had never been in so much pain. At first, I had absolutely no idea how to deal with such an unimaginable event. Now I know what needs to be done. And in order to accomplish this, we must make changes simultaneously to the societal and legal systems that handle sexual violence. Above all, I hope to enable a society in which we can discuss trauma more openly. For the sake of myself, for my sister and the friends I love, for the children of the future, including my own, and for the many people whose names and faces I don't know. Keeping my shame and anger to myself wouldn't have changed anything. That is why I decided to write this book, to speak my mind and to expose the problems that need to be addressed. At the risk of repeating myself, I did not write this book because I wanted to tell the story about what happened. I want to raise questions such as, how can we prevent assault from happening? And when assault does happen to someone, how can they get the help they need? The only reason I even bother to bring up the past is so that we can strive to have these discussions in the future. So just a little bit more about Shiori herself, the author. She was an aspiring journalist when this event happened to her, and she went on to continue her work and to become an investigative journalist. She's also a documentary filmmaker. And so this book, the approach to this book, it is a memoir, but it's really a work of investigative journalism. And she has just released the feature-length documentary that she made. It's called Black Box Diaries, which is on the festival circuit at the moment. It was at Sundance earlier this year, and it was screened at MoMA. I heard it was part of a feminist film festival as well. So Shiori has been documenting her experience, both sort of the intimate version of it, with herself and her friends, making video logs, and but also documenting the prosecution and investigation as it played out in public. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison, and for the really impactful introduction to Shiori's memoir and also her latest documentary film. So I hope our audience member, if you have a chance, you can check out Black Box Diaries. So our last speaker today is Jamie Chan. So Jamie will be doing a reading from Chonamjim's Kim Ji-young, born 1982. So welcome, Jamie. Oh, I think you are muted, Jamie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So I will be reading from Kim Ji-young, born 1982 by Chonamju, to give you a quick introduction of the book. The book was published in 2016, which coincided with Korea's Me Too movement. And it sold, I think, in Korea over 1 million copies, which is unusual for a book that deals with feminism. And it wound up paving the way for a wave of feminist literature that followed in Korea. The book is a very statistics-based, very research-based, realistic depiction of what the average Korean woman experienced growing up, women who were born in the early 1980s. It deals with it was generally understood to deal with a lot of microaggressions, misogynistic microaggressions. But in my opinion, there's actually a lot of not even microaggressions in the book. So I will read from the beginning where the main character starts to lose her mind due to the years of microaggression that drives her to psychosis. Jiyoung's abnormal behavior was first detected on the 8th of September. Taehyun remembers the exact date because it was the morning of Pengno, white dew, the first night of autumn when the temperature drops below dew point. Taehyun was having toast and milk for breakfast when Jiyoung suddenly went to the veranda and opened the window. It was quite sunny out, but the cold air rushed in as soon as the window was opened and reached the kitchen table where Taehyun was sitting. Jiyoung returned to the table with her shoulders hunched and, as she sat down, said, "I knew there was a little nip in the air these past few mornings, and today's Pengno, white morning dew on fields of gold, on Pengno when the nights grow cold." Taehyun laughed at his wife, who was talking like a much older woman. "What's up with you? You sound like your mom." "Take a light jacket with you, Chong Sobang. There's a chill in the mornings and evenings." Even then, he thought she was just joking around. Her imitation of her mother was flawless, down to her signature right eye wink when she was asking for a favor, and the elongated last syllable of Chong Sobang. He had found her staring off into space or crying over sad songs, but Taehyun figured she was just exhausted from taking care of the baby. She was basically a cheerful person, full of laughter, who often made Taehyun laugh by doing impressions of celebrities. So Taehyun shrugged off Jiyoung's imitation of her mother, gave her a hug, and went to work. When Taehyun came back from work that night, she was sleeping next to their daughter. Both were sucking their thumbs, looking cute but absurd. Gazing at the two side by side, he tugged at his wife's arm to pull her thumb out of her mouth. Jiyoung's tongue stuck out a little, and she smacked her lips, just like a baby, and then settled back into sleep.
Thank you, Jamie, for the reading. So now that all our presenters are done with readings, if our audience members are curious about any of the books they just read, please be sure to check them out. All three books are wonderful books. So with that, we will proceed to a round of discussion. So my first question for our speakers are, how did you become interested in the work that you ended up translating? What about the work appeals to you? So feel free to just raise your hand or unmute yourself if you would like to answer this question.
Yeah, I will go. For this question, there's nothing like the particular appeals to me, but more like I think there are many topics, the nuances inside the Me Too topic that's important for me to talk about, especially about sexual grooming. That's the central topic of this novel. The novel itself is running in stream of consciousness, and it talks a lot about like the twin-like friendship between two girls growing up together and living in the same neighborhood, environments overall. And Taiwan is such a society that also emphasizes so much on academic excellence and how you should like achieve like best grades and so on and so forth. So parents who have the rights and who have the privilege to offer money or offer anything for their kids to grow up and to be like as competent as they can be, there are so many ways, and one of the ways is to hire private tutors. to teach their kids and, like reinforce whichever subject they need more support on. And that system has gone sometimes underground, where you simply hire a private tutor and somehow you build this very private but intimate relationship with this teacher tutor. And so is cram school. Cram school is another system where it's an after school system where you go to and you sort of also just just spend extra time with your teachers. And during these settings, because it's out of the public school or private school, like the general public's reign, oftentimes things happen and it cannot be tracked. And there's so many things that's about sexual harassment, sexual assault that happen under these kind of educational setting that is not quote unquote official. I thought it's important to talk about it, and given that there was Me Too movement everywhere. And in 2023, in June in Taiwan, there was another wave of Me Too movement coming up, starting from the political field where someone calls somebody out, and then other professional fields such as acting, art, and so many other different fields, literary arts, also started calling out people who have ever assaulted or harassed someone. And Me Too movement overall just like becoming a wave. And it's something we need to keep reminding people of, because we're all somehow forgetful in some ways. And it's something we need to keep bringing literary works or talk about different topics and keep letting our waves come over, so we don't forget to talk about things like this.
I'll respond as well to the question, because so I translate a lot of fiction, but I translate all kinds of books, and I read a lot of memoir in English, and I had been looking for a memoir in Japanese to translate for many years, and it's sort of a different genre in the US or in the English language market. They don't have the same kinds of like tell-all memoirs in Japan, and so it's just that sort of confessional style that let's say US readers have become used to. But I was looking for something I had been looking for something in this area for a long time, and I had been talking about it with editors and agents and people over the years. So when I became aware of Shiori's book, I immediately expressed interest in it. I mean, obviously it got a certain amount of attention in and of itself, but I was also very interested in the idea of translating it, for the importance that it had in the publishing world, but also in the sort of in the international space. And in the course of while we were submitting it to publishers and then working on the translation, she was also getting so much more attention. Shiori was named, like Time magazine named her like one of the top 100 people, and she just really was getting a lot of support, it seemed, on a more international platform. But so that's and it was really just a very it was quite an opportunity, because I actually met her very early on in the process. She happened to be in New York just as we were talking about preparing a sample. I will say I translated the sample from, which was about 25% of the book. I did that in the US during the hearings for who is now the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court Justice. And it was actually really painful to be translating Shiori's book or parts of Shiori's book while that was going on, because that was the fall of 2018, I believe. So anyway.
Yes, thank you, Jana and Allison, for answering this question. So our second question is, as far as you know, how does the work translated by you influence the way the Me Too movement in East Asia plays out, especially after the book came out? As far as you know, did it like impact young people in any ways? So if anyone would like to answer this question, please feel free to unmute yourself.
I can take that one too. So, as I said, there was a certain amount of, this was published in Japan in 2017, and then it didn't come out in English until 2021. There were, I think she ended up writing like 3 different afterwords. There was the original afterword, and then Shiori wrote another afterword when we sort of made the contract got the contract with the US and UK publishers, and then more and more things just kept happening, and also her own legal process was ongoing. So we ended up making it, I think we made it into one epilogue in the US edition. But my sense from hearing from Shiori, also from seeing the documentary that just came out, which sort of brings it up to this current moment too, but also from hearing from her over these years, is that so Me Too, it didn't really take off in Japan. There was the way that the people outside of Japan were looking at what Shiori was going through, and holding her up as this icon of the movement. But it was still very difficult for people who had experienced sexual assault or harassment to come forward. And Me Too, the way that it came out about as a hashtag, was not a movement in Japan, from what I understand. And they changed it to We Too, because that made it slightly easier for people to identify with and to come forward and share their experiences. But even still, Shiori says that she never really, she experienced severe harassment, and for many years did not live in Japan, was not able to live in Japan. But I think the current hashtag is Stand With You, is the way that it became, it sort of gained more ground. So it's whereas people do know, and she certainly has some supporters, there's definitely there are a lot of people who came at her from different areas. So I do feel like she had certain she had some, the systems, the prosecution failed her on some levels. Her civil suits, she had some success, and I've seen a few instances of other people who've experienced sexual assault brave enough to come forward, but I think there's still a lot more work. It's not really comparable to what we have in the US.
Actually, following up on what Allison just mentioned, it was great that you talked about the We Too movement, because I feel like Me Too movement in so many cultures and countries, at least from Taiwan's perspective, it feels like some kind of specialization sometimes. Like those who had the experience of getting sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, or maybe some of their close ones had the experience, unfortunately, were the ones protesting for it. Instead of having this concept of we want to build a much safer environment and build awareness for the society as a whole, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like, oh, it's, like for people who need to be voiced out. It feels like that. But a lot of times I just really hope like things go beyond that, even though it's not happening right away.
Well, one of the reactions that I got when I told, so when I was translating this book, I was in Korea. So, students would ask me, or friends would ask me, what are you working on these days? And I would tell them I'm translating Kim Ji-young born 1982. And at that point, when I was translating the book, I think in 2018 or 2019, the book had been very, very popular. Everyone had heard of it or read it. And invariably, when I told people that I was translating this book, they would say, but isn't the book too Korean? Will the Anglophone readers understand it? And I thought that was fascinating, because the implication was that the oppression of women represented in this book, or oppression of women in Korea, is so unique that Anglophone readers and Western readers won't be able to identify with it. And I can understand where they're coming from, because a lot of like I said earlier, Kim Ji-young, born 1982, is based on statistical research that the writer Tognazzi did in Korea. So it goes over every stage of this girl, Kim Ji-young, born in every stage of her life, from her elementary school years to her teenage years to her her college years and beyond. And this is probably not a great way of putting it, but it's like the Forrest Gump of women's oppression in Korea, like the history. So there are all these like elements, the cultural elements, and things that are deeply embedded in the background of the Korean educational system or Korean corporate culture, and all of these things that are very Korean, that Korean readers thought, well, my Korean friends thought that it was too Korean to be translated for Anglophone readers. And I think it speaks to, on the one hand, this very defeatist idea that Korea has these like unique oppression, and that it will always be that way, that it will always be part of the culture, and it will never be understood or dealt with in ways that could be permanently remedied or improved. And I'm sort of like losing my train of thought here. I hope you edit this out. I'll stop talking now.
No, that's really fascinating to hear. I'm really glad that you brought that up, the way that you described it that way, Jamie. And it makes me think about there's something that, you know, like in Black Box, Shiori, towards the end of it, I mean, as I said, she sort of not attacks, but she investigates the systems that enable this culture of harassment and culture of assault and oppression. And one of the things that she goes into is it's referred to as chikam in Japan, which is like groping. It's basically public groping. And you know, she talks about her earliest experiences as a very young girl. It's something that happens on trains, in parks, on the street, and it's something, you know, it happened at the beach. It happened at like when she was swimming, and she talks about the impact that those experiences had on her as a person. And I think, you know, that's the kind of thing that many women, many people in Japan can identify with, but I feel like it's also something that happens around the world. And it kind of speaks to what Jenna is describing in the book that she translated about the grooming and the way that these patterns just, you know, sometimes they're almost, we don't even, you know, we don't notice them until somebody points them out sometimes.
Yeah, and just following up on what Jamie and Allison were talking about, also sexual grooming is also about so we come back to the concept of consent. Like sexual grooming has a complicated relationship with consent here, because there's a lot of gaslighting, a lot of not knowing enough to say no. I mean, I thought that was important to talk about, and at the same time, I feel like Me Too movement overall, at least in the Taiwanese context, there's also a level of, I'm like, when this book was published in Taiwan, and also like Jamie's experience, everyone's like, this is so Taiwanese. Like there's so many things that's not explained, and there's so many bias that's very realistic to what Taiwanese society is now having. That's like, how do we translate that into English, and how do we make it known? Those are also questions. And at the same time, like I feel like in Taiwan, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and so on, they only victimize like women or queer people, and more of women than queer or beyond. Like it feels also like back to specialization, like, oh, it's only these people would experience and things like that. But the fact is everyone can experience it. And it's important to talk about it because it's not something that is, I feel like there's certain stereotypes such as, oh, you don't like someone isn't be careful enough and then someone is getting pulled away by something else. It feels like some kind of robberies or some kind of incident, but a lot of occasions it actually happen in the most intimate or the most familiar settings.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And it's really interesting hearing what Jamie and Jana said about what those two books covered are considered to be very particular to South Korea or Taiwan. Just based on my observation of Chinese social media, all three books that you translated are hugely popular among this generation of Chinese young women and Chinese feminists. And I often hear people talking about, even though they're born and raised in China, they really see themselves in Kim Ji-young, Lin Yihan, and Shiori Ito. Like they really can see so many similarities despite differences in ethnicity or nationalities. So I felt like I have read all three books, and I really think those three books are so impactful in China and really help this young generation of Chinese feminists to become more interested in feminist issue and also in cultivating transnational feminist solidarity. So I'm really hoping that with the English translation of all three books, we can also expect more international solidarity with East Asian feminist movement. So a related question that I want to ask Allison is that, so Jamie mentioned the response to the English translation of Kim Ji-young 1982. Have you heard any Anglophone readers' response to Black Box? Did they find what Shioli experienced to be very different, or like the word Jana used, very special, like very specific? I'm just curious if Anglophone readers as a whole has commented on the translation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. When we launched the book in translation, it was still during the pandemic, but one of the most exciting things is that we were able to host a conversation with Chanel Miller, who is, if you're, her book in English was called Know My Name. And that book, I think, is really that book, the way that Chanel wrote it, the way that she was public about her experience. I know that that really resonated with Shiori, and it was just exciting to hear them be in dialogue together. And I think it really, that helped to, I don't know, I guess if you do have to think about this when you're publishing things like and marketing things like position this book, because this is not just a book in translation. You know, it's not going to sort of slide into the sort of literary translation audience that typically reads books in translation. So, I mean, I have, because I'm not an academic, I haven't really had that much, I haven't heard that much about the way that it's been received, say, on campus. I mean, I can hear from you, Lynn, and I hear from people who I encounter directly how I'm also not on social media. So I don't know what exactly the response has been, you know, in that sense. But it has almost entirely been positive in terms of, you know, admiration for Shiori and for the way that she is creating a different conversation around things in about what's happening in Japan. And again, she is not only talking about Japan in the sort of, you know, she's talking about she talks about how things work in Japan and the laws that have changed, the statutes that have shifted even in the time that she's been doing her own investigations into it. But she goes into, like, she goes to Sweden and investigates how they treat and support survivors there, as well as, you know, different cultures as well. And so I know that she does a lot of work with like she does work with FGM in Africa. And so she's definitely reaching across cultures. So yeah, I think it helps that she has just such a, and I know that she's herself has been really buoyed by the support that she receives from readers in many different languages, as in China and Taiwan. She mentioned when I saw her in March for her documentary, and she was very excited to hear that Jenna's translation was coming out of Fang Shiqi's First Love Paradise, because when she had been on tour in Taiwan, people had told her about that book, but she doesn't read Chinese and wasn't able to read it. So she's excited to read it once it's available.
So touched to hear that.
Yes, thank you very much. And our last question today is that considering the fact that all of the books you translated deal with very heavy topics, and some books even have very explicit depiction of sexual violence, I'm wondering, as translators, what are some strategies or practices you have employed to deal with this kind of very difficult, mentally challenging, and also intellectually challenging translation work? Thank you.
Jimmy, would you like to get us?
Yeah, okay. So it wasn't just Kim Ji-young born 1982, but even before I translated this book, I don't know about Jenna and Allison, but because most of the books that I'm translating, well, I can only translate from Korean to English. Those are my only two languages, and my dominant language is English. So I'm going from Korean to English. I ended up, and because I only translate literary fiction, I ended up translating a lot of very, very, very harrowing narratives, and not just feminist literature, but like North Korean defector literature, political oppression, all of these things. And so, especially in the beginning of my career, it hit me very, very hard to like really fully immerse myself in these narratives and fully picture the scenes of violence that are happening. So in one case, I was translating something about the May 15th massacre in Gwangju. This was 1980, where the military government stormed a city and basically killed an entire city that was rebelling. It was just full weeping. It was just full weeping, like weeping and translating at the same time, because, you know, deadline, you have to meet the deadline. So you cannot stop translating. So you're just weeping and translating. At the same time, I put paper towels down on the desk and was just translating. And then for Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, I tried to take a lot of breaks, like as I was working. I tried to take as many breaks as possible and work on other things, and then come back. And it's actually difficult to work on very different kinds of, you know, like more fun stories or like lighthearted stories, and then come back to this. So I use this tactic of using soundtracks to re-immerse myself into the book. So I ended up listening to a lot of Shostakovich symphonies while translating Kim Ji-young. In terms of self-care, you know, just like coping in general, therapy works, because as a translator, like when you form a relationship with the book, with the characters, things in your personal history, your past traumas, they're all going to come out and interact with the story. And I'm always afraid that, although it's not something that you can avoid, I'm always afraid that I'm going to project my traumas onto the translation choices. So I always need to take a step back and ask myself, is this my trauma or the trauma of the character? or is it both? Because it could be both. So I talked that out with my therapist, and also long walks with my dog always helps, long walks.
I agree with long walks. That's what I do too while translating this novel. It's so heavy and there's so much that maybe when I was translating the book itself, like the process itself was more logistical, like practical, and I did the research I needed. But at the same time, like for me personally, like the texts and the topics like came back when I'm most vulnerable, like late in the night or when I'm just feeling a little sad. Some days like it rains, things like that. Therapist works, yes, for sure. Something else I did was I created, in particular with this book, because it's called First Love Paradise, I searched up a lot of different songs that has different cultural interpretations of paradise. And I found this little thing that I did while translating the book interesting. And some of the paradise songs, like in French, Spanish, which I often hear from, is really optimal and like interesting. And so I actually put them all together while translating a book. So I don't only immerse in like the dark feelings of translating the story itself, but also just like, oh, paradise has other interpretations too. And that's kind of a reminder for myself while translating the book. And at the same time, I think it's really just about like changing the whole mood and changing the whole sense of place while being in close relation with this book. So I do a lot of sports, like I do weightlifting and I run a lot. And when running, I like to run by the Riverside Park and things like that. So that would give me that an access to tell myself that things can be different. Like there are systems and things that are hard to change and that are just gonna be like that for decades or longer, or who knows. It's really disheartening sometimes to think about that it's really hard for us to change as individuals or even as collective. But I feel like I needed that access to feel hopeful again. And I constantly are in the search of finding new ways to feel hopeful. And I guess that's what this book was bringing me to, and I find meaningful as well.
For me, as I mentioned, I had translated a certain portion of the book, and it was really difficult because it was coinciding with events going on in the States. But like I had chosen that was a sample that we had used to find a publisher. I had thought that those passages were some of the more harrowing parts of the book. And then when I went to translate the full manuscript, like some of the other parts were equally challenging. There's a whole section of emails that Shiori had with the person who, her alleged assault, the person who assaulted her, and the gaslighting involved in that those interactions was deeply disturbing. And so I do have my own forms of self-care in general, but it was really kind of taken to a different level when I was working on this book, and I've continued to use it for other projects as well. Like I do yoga, and I've been doing body work for several years, and or I have a person who I call my body worker, and she's really like, I mean, she's a sort of a physical trainer, but she's really like a physical therapist. I mean, and I mean therapist in the way that Jenna and Jamie were talking about, I think a talk therapist, but it's like I could bring to my sessions with her, like what I'm feeling and where I'm feeling it in my body, and sort of be able to move through that, to sort of readjust my energy, but also to like figure out strategies for like they also were talking about like being able to come, to sort of move into the mode of translating this work, being able to immerse yourself, but then not having to, being able to step out of it so that I'm not carrying it around with me all the rest of the time that I'm not working, because it's too much. And I know that, translating it is far removed from what Shiori actually experienced. And so, it just pales in comparison to the trauma. But I think, sexual assault, sexual violence is so prevalent that if you haven't experienced it yourself, you probably most likely have people who are either family or friends who have. And it can be very triggering. And so it's important to find ways to protect yourself. And Shiori says that in her book. She says that in her documentary. She sort of, encourages people to find ways to take care of themselves. So.
Thank you so much for sharing these great self-care strategies. I wonder, before we conclude, are there any final thoughts that any of you would like to share with our audience member today?
I think I'm very honored to be here talking to Jamie, Allison, and Lynn about our Me Too movement titles, because I think it's important to have a sense of solidarity, of connecting international titles to one another, even though they are, each story, each narratives are unique in its own sense and has its own specifics and nuances that it wants to voice out for. But I love that we're connecting all this and having this conversation together. And I think it's important to do so with like other titles from different cultures, languages, and so on. So it's been great spending this time with you all and having this conversation and to make this happen.
So as I was preparing for today's roundtable, I was thinking about how far women's rights has come since the translation, and I thought about the reversal of Roe v. Wade and all the ways that we have taken many steps back. And I just wanted to say, I know that the books that we translate are hard to read. I mean, they're hard to translate, they're hard to write, they're hard to read, but read them anyway, because we cannot give up. If we give up, it's going to continue to, the things that we thought were impossible that we would always have are going away. So I just want to say, let's not give up. Read the books.
Thank you, Jamie. That's it's important to hear. And I would prefer to leave the last word with you, because I think that was really well said, but I'm really honored and just grateful that we were able to have this conversation.
Oh, thanks to Jaina, Allison, and Jamie again for your time. And just a reminder that Jaina's book is upcoming next month. So audience members, if you're interested in this topic, and especially Me Too movement in Taiwan, please make sure to check out Jaina's translated work. And also Allison and Jamie are constantly putting out new translated work. Please also stay tuned for their works. So with that, we will conclude today's session, and we want to extend our sincere gratitude to SANT JORDI USA Festival again for giving us this space, and we hope audience members can enjoy the rest of the festival. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Mary Ann, for making this space possible for this conversation to take place. And we're looking forward to seeing this roundtable on SANT JORDI Festival.